The wind came low and mean across the plains that evening, dragging a red haze of dust through the fading light. The sun had sunk behind the buttes, leaving the sky bruised in purple and fire. The fields lay still except for the dry creak of grass and the soft, distant whine of a coyote. Out there, just beyond the broken fence line of Miller's ranch, two figures stood facing each other like the world itself had gone quiet to listen. She had that look again, the kind that made men shift uncomfortably and women whisper. Chin lifted, eyes sharp as flint, one gloved hand resting against her hip. Her coat was torn, boots scuffed from a hard ride, yet she stood there proud, unbent, her chest rising steady against the chill. Across from her, the rancher watched without a word, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. His hands were rough and calloused, the kind made for work, not talk. The silence between them was stretched thin, ready to snap. The horses behind them snorted impatiently, kicking at the dirt as if they too could feel the heat rising from old wounds. "You call that your best?" she said finally, her voice low, almost mocking. "Is that all you've got?" Her words cut through the air like a whip. The rancher didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, the muscle along it working slow as he shifted his weight. He'd heard her talk before, always too bold, too sure, like pride itself had taken the shape of a woman. "You don't know when to quit," he said quietly. "I don't plan to," she shot back. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rasping through the fence posts. Then, without another word, he stepped forward. The ground crunched under his boots as he closed the distance between them. She didn't move. Her eyes didn't waver. Whatever had started this, it had gone too far to stop now. The story of how they got there wasn't simple. Nothing ever was in those days. Folks around the village had been talking for weeks, about the drought, about cattle gone missing, and about the stubborn rancher up on the North Ridge who refused to sell his land no matter how bad things got. And then there was her, the stranger who rode into town 2 months back with a rifle strapped across her back and a chip on her shoulder. No one knew exactly where she'd come from, only that she wasn't afraid to stand her ground. Even when the world tried to knock her down, she'd come with talk of partnership, of merging cattle routes and water rights. But what began as business had turned into something else. A contest neither had planned, but both were too proud to lose. Each word, each look, each challenge between them was a test of will, and neither would give an inch. Down in the village, the talk at the saloon had already taken sides. Some said the rancher was right to defend what was his, to keep his land and pride intact. Others whispered that the woman had grit that put most men to shame. They said she'd come from hard country out east, where winters froze the soul and only the toughest survived. Whatever the truth, their feud had become the talk of the plains. Earlier that day, she'd ridden straight up his drive, dust flying behind her horse. He'd been mending the south fence, sweat running down his neck as he worked. She didn't even wait for him to stand before she started. "You think this land makes you untouchable," she said. "You think a few fences and a stubborn jaw will keep people from pushing you out?" He leaned against the fence post, squinting against the sun. "It's kept me standing this long." "Not for much longer," she'd replied. "You've run out of time and water both." That was when something in him snapped. Or maybe it wasn't just anger. Maybe it was the weariness of a man who'd lost too much already, who'd buried a wife young, fought the storms and droughts alone, and seen every promise of peace broken by greed and lies. He saw in her not just defiance but a mirror of his own stubborn fire, and that made her dangerous. Now as dusk settled, the world seemed to shrink around them. She shifted her stance, her boots sinking slightly into the dust. The wind lifted a strand of hair across her cheek, but she didn't move to brush it away. Her eyes stayed on him, steady, challenging. "Why keep fighting?" he asked, his voice low but heavy. "Ain't you tired yet?" She smiled faintly, though it wasn't out of kindness. Tired doesn't mean beaten. He studied her, the set of her jaw, the wildness in her gaze. There was something about her that refused to break, like the land itself, scarred but alive. He had to admit, even through the anger, that he respected her, maybe even admired her. But admiration didn't change what was at stake. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, carved out of dust and sweat, built by hands that didn't know the word surrender. He wasn't about to let anyone, especially a stranger, take it apart. And she, for all her talk of fairness, had her own reasons. There were rumors she'd been cheated once, betrayed by someone who'd promised her land of her own. Maybe this fight wasn't just about cattle or fences. It was about proving she still had control over her life. The sky deepened, the first stars winking through. The air turned cooler, brushing against them with the faint scent of rain that might never come. Between them, the tension hung thick, a rope pulled taut and ready to snap. "You think you can win this?" he said quietly. "I don't think," she replied. "I know." And with that, she stepped forward, closing the last few feet between them. He met her gaze, steady as the earth beneath his boots. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. The sound of crickets, the far-off bark of a dog, the rustle of dry leaves, all fading into silence. Something unspoken passed between them then, something raw and fierce, born not of hate but of a strange, stubborn respect. "You're proud," he said finally. "Maybe," she said, "but so are you." His hand flexed at his side, the muscles in his arm tightening as if bracing for the next storm. He didn't know whether to walk away or push forward. Pride was a dangerous thing. It could keep a person standing, but it could also be the reason they fell. She took another step, close enough now that he could see the flicker of firelight in her eyes from the lantern hanging near the barn. Her voice came softer this time, almost a whisper. "Then show me," she said. "Show me what you've got." The challenge lingered in the air, thick as the scent of dust and rain. The rancher didn't answer right away. His pulse drummed steady in his chest as he looked at her, this stranger who had come from nowhere and turned his whole world upside down. In that moment, it wasn't just about land or pride or who would bend first. It was about something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. The wind picked up again, sweeping through the empty yard. The horses stamped nervously and the sky rumbled low in the distance. Somewhere beyond the ridge, lightning flashed, casting their faces in brief white light. Two figures locked in a battle older than the soil they stood on. He finally spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "Careful what you ask for." Her smirk didn't fade. "I'm not afraid of you." And as the first drops of rain began to fall, slow and heavy against the dry earth, the distance between them vanished. No one in the village saw what happened next. But by morning, the storm had passed. The fields lay soaked and silent, and both their horses were gone. Only the wind told stories that day, of pride, of challenge, and of two souls too stubborn to yield. And somewhere out there, beneath the vast, untamed sky, their fight wasn't over. Not yet. By sunrise, the storm had rolled on toward the mountains, leaving the land washed in a pale, clean light. The world seemed quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. The ranch lay still, fences glistening wet, the ground soft beneath the hooves of restless cattle. From the porch, the rancher watched the mist drift over the fields, his hat tilted low to shield his eyes from the glare of morning. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the defiant tilt of her chin, the way her eyes had burned even through the rain. She hadn't come back since last night. He told himself it didn't matter, but something about her absence gnawed at him like a loose nail in a boot. Small, sharp, impossible to ignore. He turned from the porch, jaw tight, and headed toward the stables. The barn smelled of damp hay and old leather. His horse whickered softly as he passed, but the other stall, hers, stood empty. Only the faint outline of hoofprints in the mud showed where she'd been. He crouched down and touched the prints, tracing the edges with his fingers. They pointed south toward the river trail. "She's not done," he muttered under his breath. He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands, eyes hardening. Whatever she was after, she'd make her move soon. And when she did, he needed to be ready. Out past the fences, the land stretched wide and quiet. It wasn't just open space, it was memory. His father had built this ranch from nothing but stubborn will. Every post, every acre carried years of sweat, storms, and sacrifice. The rancher could still remember being a boy, watching his father work the cattle while his mother brought water from the well. They'd never had much, but what they built was theirs. And now someone wanted to take it away. He didn't hate her, not really. In truth, there was something about her he understood too well. She wasn't like the others who tried to buy him out with smooth words and false promises. She fought like someone who'd already lost too much to walk away. Still, he couldn't afford to trust her. The drought had left the wells near dry, and the cattle were already growing lean. If she gained control of the South Pasture's water rights, it would be the end of him. He saddled his horse and rode out slow, the leather creaking beneath him. The sun rose higher, burning off the mist as he followed the trail toward the ridge. The air smelled of wet soil and sagebrush. He kept his eyes sharp, scanning for any sign of her, broken twigs, fresh tracks, anything that told him she hadn't gone far. About a mile out, He found what he was looking for. Her horse's tracks turned off toward the old creek bed, dry most of the year, but still deep enough to hide a rider's trail. He followed it, the sound of hooves muffled in the soft mud. At a bend in the creek, he found her camp. The fire was out, only a few smoking embers left. Her saddlebag sat half open beside a rock, and her rifle leaned against a fallen log, but she was nowhere in sight. He dismounted, listening. A crow called somewhere overhead, sharp and lonely. He stepped closer to the fire and saw something that made him pause. Spread out near the ashes were old land maps, his land marked with red ink. The borders were circled, notes scrawled along the edges. She'd been studying his property like a soldier studying enemy lines. Before he could look closer, a voice behind him broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come." He turned. She stood there a few paces away, hair still damp from the night rain, hat pulled low over her eyes. Her rifle was slung over one shoulder, but her hands were empty. "You left your horse," he said. "I didn't want to wake the town," she replied calmly. "Didn't think you'd follow me this far." "You should have known better," he said. They faced each other again, that same tension stretching between them. Only now the edge of anger was mixed with something heavier, a quiet understanding that neither wanted to admit. She nodded toward the maps. "You think I came here to steal from you?" "I think you came to finish something you started," she sighed, looking past him toward the horizon. "You don't know what I've lost." "Then tell me," he said. She hesitated, her jaw tightening before she spoke. 3 years ago, I had land like yours. Smaller, rougher, but it was mine. Then came the drought. I went to the bank for help, signed papers I didn't understand. By the time I figured out what I'd done, it was gone. They took everything." He studied her face, the shadows that flickered through her eyes. For a moment, he saw past the pride, the tiredness beneath it, the ache that came from fighting too long. "You think taking mine will make it right?" he asked quietly. "I think the world only listens to the ones who take what they can," she said. "The rest just get buried in the dust." He stepped closer, close enough that the air between them felt charged again. "That's not how it works here." "Maybe not for you," she said. Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth, and he realized then that whatever had brought her to his land wasn't just greed or pride, it was survival. The wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwoods. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You could have asked," he said. "Would you have helped me?" she asked in return. He didn't answer, because deep down, he wasn't sure he would have. She turned away, kneeling by her bag to gather her things. "I didn't come to steal," she said, "but I'll fight for what I need." He watched her work, the steady, practiced way she packed her gear. There was a strength in her movements, quiet and certain. He felt the same mix of frustration and respect that had been haunting him for weeks. "You'll never win this way," he said finally. She glanced up at him, eyes sharp again. "Then you better make sure I lose." He felt a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth, though he didn't mean it as one. "You're trouble." "I've been called worse." They stood there a moment longer, the sound of the wind filling the space between them. Then she swung her saddle onto her horse and mounted. "Stay off the north ridge," he warned as she turned her horse toward the open field. "That land's not forgiving." She met his gaze one last time. "Neither am I." And then she was gone, her figure growing smaller against the wide gold horizon. He stayed by the fire long after she left, staring at the half-burned maps until the ashes turned cold. Something told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. When he finally rode back to the ranch, the sky was already fading into evening again. The ranch hands were in the yard talking low, casting curious glances his way. They'd heard the stories, how the stranger had challenged him, how she'd walked away with nothing but a smirk. "Boss," one of them said, "you think she'll be back?" The rancher tightened his reins. "She's not the kind that quits." He looked out over the land, the fences stretching long and straight across the fading light. He'd spent his life protecting this place, but for the first time he wondered what it was all for. Maybe pride had blinded him just as much as pain had driven her. Still, he couldn't let her win. That night, as the wind rose again, he sat by the lantern in his cabin, studying the same maps she had marked. Each red circle she'd drawn burned into his mind. She wasn't just after land, she was after something deeper, a chance to reclaim what the world had taken. And though he hated to admit it, part of him understood. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him, and stared into the dark. Somewhere out there she was planning her next move. And he, stubborn as ever, was waiting. The storm had passed, but a different one was building, slow, quiet, and dangerous. One that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with two hearts too proud to back down. By the time the moon rose high, the land was silent again. But in that silence something had shifted. The fight between them wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about truth, and how far either of them was willing to go to defend it, and neither one of them was ready to surrender. The days that followed passed with the heavy stillness that comes before something breaks. The rancher threw himself into work, mending fences, driving cattle toward what little grass the range still offered, and pretending not to think about the woman who had disappeared south of the ridge. But every time the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain or the sound of distant hoofbeats, his thoughts turned back to her. It wasn't just the fight that bothered him, it was what the fight stood for. She'd shown him something he didn't want to face, that his pride might be the very thing leading him toward ruin. Out across the valley, life in the small village carried on as usual, or so it seemed. The saloon stayed open late, the blacksmith's hammer rang through the mornings, and gossip moved faster than the river. Folks talked about the rancher's stand, about the stranger who'd come out of nowhere and nearly bested him, about how the two of them seemed tied together by something no one could quite name. Some said she was a thief in disguise. Others whispered that she was part of a land syndicate from back east. Whatever the truth was, people liked the story. Meanwhile, she hadn't gone far. Her small camp had shifted to the edge of the canyon, where the land dipped low and wild. From there, she could see his ranch in the distance, its house, the smoke from the chimney, the neat rows of fencing dividing the land. She watched it like someone studying a puzzle, her mind turning over every detail. The maps she'd taken weren't about conquest anymore. They were about understanding what she was truly up against. She'd lived through worse than droughts. She'd seen her family's land seized in the name of progress, her brother killed in a senseless border dispute, her father buried in ground that never stayed soft for long. Pride had kept her moving then, and it kept her moving now. But watching the rancher from afar, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe his fight was just as desperate as hers. That evening, she rode into town quietly, her hat low, her horse dusty and tired. The streets were half empty, lamplight spilling from the saloon's windows. She dismounted and tied her horse near the trough, then pushed open the door. Inside, the piano played something slow and off-key, and the air smelled of whiskey and tobacco. The bartender looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes before he smoothed his face into a polite smile. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said. "Didn't expect to come back," she replied. "Is the land agent still in town?" He nodded toward the corner table where a man in a brown suit sat shuffling papers. She approached, her boots soft against the wood floor. The man looked up as she stopped beside him. "You again," he said, his tone somewhere between irritation and interest. "Thought you'd given up." "Not yet," she said. "I need to know who's been buying up the southern properties." He hesitated, glancing around the room before lowering his voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but there's talk of a big company. Railway men from Chicago, maybe farther east. They're offering fair prices, but once they've got the land, they'll drive the small folks out." Her jaw tightened. "And the rancher?" "He's the last holdout," the agent said. "Won't sell for any price," she nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." Back at the ranch, the same evening found the rancher sitting by the fire, his mind too restless for sleep. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters, carrying the scent of wet sage and pine. He poured himself a small measure of whiskey, watching the flames flicker and shift. He wasn't afraid of losing. He'd lost before, cattle to the drought, friends to bad luck, family to time. What scared him was the thought that he'd been fighting the wrong enemy. The woman's words kept echoing in his head. "You don't know what I've lost." He thought of her again, of the way she'd looked when she told him her story, and something in his chest ached. He'd told himself he didn't care, but that was a lie. She reminded him too much of himself, too proud, too worn down, and too stubborn to admit the world wasn't fair. He didn't know it yet, but she was closer than he thought. The next morning, he found fresh tracks near the northern pasture, 2 sets of hooves leading toward the canyon. He followed them, suspicion rising with each step. By the time he reached the edge of the ridge, the sun had burned high and hot. He stopped his horse near a cluster of rocks and scanned the distance, That's when he saw her. She was standing by a lone tree, looking out across the valley, her figure outlined by the bright sky. "What are you doing here?" he called out. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Same thing you're doing," she said. Watching what's left, he dismounted, walking toward her. "You planning to take another run at me?" She shook her head. "Not this time," he frowned. "Then what's this about?" She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "You were right about one thing. Someone's trying to take your land. Not me, not anyone local. A company from back east. They're using the drought to push you out. I thought maybe if I took the rights first, I could trade them for a piece of my own. But now," she stopped, looking away. "Now I see they'll come for me too." He took the paper from her, his brow furrowed as he read. It was a letter, official, stamped with a seal he didn't recognize, full of legal words meant to sound fair but dripping with deceit. "So that's their game," he muttered. "They'll move fast," she said. "By winter, this whole valley could be theirs." He looked at her, trying to decide if he could trust her. Every instinct told him to keep his guard up, but her eyes held a tired honesty he couldn't ignore. "Why tell me this?" he asked. "Because I can't fight them alone," she said simply. "And neither can you." The wind swept across the ridge, cold and sharp. He turned toward the horizon where the sun hung low and fierce. "You're asking me to join forces with someone who's been trying to break me," he said. She met his gaze. "I'm asking you to survive." He studied her a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "But if this goes wrong, we both lose everything." She gave a faint smile. "Seems we already have." From that day, an uneasy truce settled between them. They met in secret, late evenings near the old mill creek away from prying eyes. Together, they mapped the lands in danger, marking where the company men had already moved in. The rancher sent word through his few allies, warning other landholders of what was coming. But word travels fast in small towns. Before long, whispers reached the ears of men who didn't take kindly to interference. One night, just before dawn, the rancher's foreman rode up to the house, his face pale in the lamplight. "There's trouble," he said. "3 riders came through the south gate. Said they're looking for you." The rancher grabbed his coat, his revolver heavy at his hip. "Where are they now?" "Down by the barn. They ain't the talking kind." He stepped outside, the cold air biting his skin. The riders waited near the corral, their horses restless, their faces hidden beneath wide hats. One of them dismounted and took a step forward. "Got a message from our employer," the man said. "You and that woman been stirring up too much noise. Time you let go of this land." The rancher's voice was calm but hard. "Tell your employer he's wasting his time." The man smiled thinly. "We figured you'd say that." From the shadows near the barn, a faint click echoed, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. The rancher didn't move. He knew that sound. She stepped out from behind the wagon, her rifle aimed steady. "You boys might want to rethink that offer," she said. For a second, no one spoke. The tension cut the air like a blade. The riders exchanged uncertain glances. The rancher could see in their eyes that they weren't ready for a fight, not against 2 people who'd rather die on their land than give it up. After a long moment, the man spat into the dirt and swung onto his horse. "This ain't over," he said. They rode off into the dark, their silhouettes fading against the pale light of morning. When the sound of hooves finally disappeared, the rancher turned toward her. "You always show up right on time," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "Could say the same for you." Neither of them said more. The sun began to rise again, spreading thin gold light across the wet grass and broken fence lines. The land looked almost peaceful, though both knew peace was just another illusion. The fight wasn't over. It had only shifted. What lay ahead wasn't just a battle for land, but for something deeper: trust, survival, pride, and maybe, somewhere under all that, the faint beginning of something neither dared name. As the wind swept through the open fields, carrying the scent of rain once more, both knew that before this was done, the land would test them harder than it ever had before, and the question lingering between them, of who would break first, still waited for its answer. The days that followed turned the valley tense as a coiled wire. Word spread that the company men were coming back, this time not just to threaten but to claim. The small ranches near the river had already fallen quiet. Families packing wagons moving east before the papers were signed and the fences torn down. Dust hung over the road from their leaving, settling heavy over everything. The rancher felt the weight of it every time he stepped outside. The land had always been hard, but it was honest. Now it felt like the ground itself was being stolen piece by piece. He worked from dawn to dusk, repairing what he could, shoring up weak spots in the fence, checking water lines. Every sound seemed sharper, the creak of a gate, the low groan of the wind through the barn rafters, even the restless stirring of the cattle. At night, he and the woman met by the canyon, where the sound of the river hid their voices. Their uneasy alliance had turned into something else, trust built out of necessity, not comfort. She brought information from town, names of men who'd signed their land away under pressure, notes from the agent who'd slipped her word of what was coming. He brought supplies, maps, and sometimes silence. Between them there was always that tension, like a fire that hadn't found air yet but would soon. One night she came later than usual, her horse lathered from the ride. She dismounted fast, eyes sharp. "They're moving sooner than we thought," she said. 2 days, maybe less. "They've got wagons, tools, and more men than before." He nodded slowly, jaw tightening. "They mean to take it all in one sweep." She handed him a letter, folded and creased from her pocket. "The land agent left this for me. Said once they start, there's no stopping the claims. Everything north of the river will be under their control." He unfolded it, scanning the elegant printed script. The words hit him like cold water. It wasn't just the ranches. They planned to reroute the water rights, cutting off every small holding that depended on the wells and streams. It would starve the land out in months. "They're not building a railway," he said darkly. "They're clearing us out," she nodded. "They don't want the land. They want control of the water." The fire beside them crackled low, throwing shadows across their faces. The rancher's hand curled into a fist. "If we stand down, it's over. If we stand up, they'll come after us harder." She met his gaze, steady as always. "Then we stand anyway." The wind picked up around them, carrying the dry scent of dust and pine. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "At first light," he said. The next morning broke red and sharp, clouds streaking the sky like brushstrokes of blood. The rancher gathered what hands he had left, 4 men too proud to run, too poor to leave. They loaded rifles, hammered boards, and watched the horizon for dust trails. By noon, a faint line appeared far to the south. She rode in from the ridge, stopping beside him. "They're coming," she said. He didn't answer, just watched the horizon. The sun shimmered hot over the plains and the dust grew thicker, resolving slowly into a column of riders and wagons. They moved slow but steady, the kind of march that said they didn't expect resistance. "They think we'll back down," the rancher said. "They don't know us," she replied. He turned to her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You sure you want to stay for this?" Her voice was calm. "I didn't come this far to watch from a distance." The men reached the ridge by late afternoon. The lead rider, dressed in a black coat and city boots unsuited for dust, raised a hand. "Mr. Miller," he called, his voice smooth and practiced. "We've come on official business." The rancher stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Official or not, you're trespassing." The man smiled like someone humoring a child. "I have paperwork here granting us authority to survey this land for development. You've been given fair notice." "I've given my answer," the rancher said. "Then I suggest you reconsider." The woman's voice cut in before he could speak again. "You're not surveying. You're stealing." The man turned toward her, surprise flickering across his face. "Ah," he said. "The lady from the east. I'd heard you were involved. How unfortunate." She dismounted, walking closer. "You can wave your papers all you like. Doesn't make them right." His smile thinned. "You're a smart woman. You must know what happens to people who get in the way of progress." The air felt heavy then, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The rancher stepped forward until he was standing toe-to-toe with the man. "You've had your warning. Leave while you can." The man studied him for a moment, then turned back toward his riders. "Burn the outer fences," he said coldly. That was when the first gunshot cracked the air. No one knew who fired it. Maybe one of the ranch hands, maybe one of the hired men. But once the sound came, everything broke loose. Horses reared, shouts echoed across the field, and smoke began to rise where the dry grass caught flame. The rancher shouted orders, his voice rough over the chaos. The woman ran for the water trough, filling buckets and throwing them toward the fence line. The men fought to keep the fire from spreading, their faces streaked with sweat and ash. But the company riders were armed and organized. 2 of them rode toward the barn, torches in hand. The rancher saw them and grabbed his rifle, firing once. One rider fell. The other turned tail, vanishing into the haze. The smell of smoke filled the air, thick and bitter. The cattle bellowed in panic, kicking against the corral. Sparks leapt into the wind. "Get the herd to the river," the rancher shouted. She turned, coughing through the smoke. "You'll be overrun if you stay." He shook his head. Not yet. The fire was creeping closer, the heat rising in waves. Through the smoke, he saw the man in the black coat retreating toward the wagons, shouting orders of his own. The hired guns regrouped, their rifles glinting in the light. "They'll come again before dark," she said. Breathless. "Then we'll be ready," he replied. As the sun dipped low, painting the land in gold and ash, they stood together at the edge of the field, watching the flames die into smoke. The ranch looked battered but still standing. The men were exhausted, faces streaked and grim. "They won't stop," she said quietly. He nodded. "No, but neither will we." Later that night, the wind carried the smell of burnt wood and iron. The rancher sat on the porch, staring out into the darkness. She joined him silently, her coat pulled tight against the cold. For a long time, neither spoke. "You should go," he said finally. "They'll come for you too." "I know," she said. "But I'm not leaving." He looked at her then, really looked, at the soot on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the steadiness that hadn't wavered once. "You could have had a different life," he said quietly. "So could you," she answered. Thunder rolled low in the distance, though the sky was still clear. Somewhere out beyond the ridge they could hear the faint rumble of wagons, the company regrouping, waiting for daylight. The rancher stood slowly. "Tomorrow decides it," he said. She nodded. One way or another, they stayed awake till dawn, the light of the fire casting long shadows behind them. Each had their own thoughts, their own fears, but both knew what was coming. When morning broke, the valley was silent. The wind had shifted east, carrying the smell of dry earth and the faint trace of smoke from the burned fences. Then, faint but certain, came the sound of hooves again, steady, deliberate, and many. The rancher's hand went to his rifle. The woman stood beside him, her face calm but her eyes alive with fire. This was it. The moment everything had been leading to. Pride, land, survival, all about to collide. The company riders crested the hill, sunlight flashing on their guns and polished harness. The rancher felt his heart pounding steady as a drum. He glanced at her once, just once, and she gave a small nod. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "don't hold back." He took a breath, the air sharp and dry. Wouldn't dream of it. The riders slowed as they reached the open stretch before the ranch. Dust rose around them in clouds, turning the air thick and gold. The man in the black coat rode at the front again, expression cold, certain. The rancher stepped forward, rifle at his side, his boots firm in the dirt. The woman stood beside him, unflinching. The wind stilled. The world seemed to hold its breath again. Then the lead rider raised his hand, ready to give the order. The rancher's grip tightened. And the valley waited, balanced on the edge of war. The first shot broke the silence like glass. Dust flew up from the road as the two sides clashed in the early light, echoing across the valley. Horses reared, men shouted, and smoke from gunfire mixed with the lingering scent of burnt fences. The rancher ducked behind the corral rail, firing twice before rolling for cover. The woman shouted warnings from the barn, pulling one of the ranch hands back when he stumbled near the gate. It was chaos. Raw, desperate, and loud. But under it all ran something steady, the sound of the river nearby, the one thing neither side could own. The fight stretched across the yard, through the smoke and grit. The rancher saw the man in the black coat shouting orders from his horse, a pistol raised. His voice carried above the rest, confident and sure, until the rancher's bullet tore through his hat and sent him diving for cover. When the dust began to settle, both sides had fallen quiet again. The company men pulled back, realizing the ranchers weren't going to surrender. A few wounded horses stumbled off, and one wagon lay overturned, its wheels still spinning. The sun had climbed high now, washing the field in a harsh white glare. The woman walked out from the barn, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "They're regrouping," she said. The rancher reloaded his rifle. "Let them. They'll come back smaller next time. They always do." But she shook her head. "No, not this time." She handed him a folded paper, creased and smudged with ash. This came from the land agent before he left town. He said if you could prove the river's flow was diverted before the sale, their entire claim would collapse. He frowned. "And how would we prove that?" Her eyes lifted toward the ridge. "There's a survey marker near the old Apache trail. It shows the original water line. If it's still there, it's enough to fight them." The rancher stared at her for a long moment, the weight of what she was saying sinking in. For months he'd been fighting with bullets and fences. Maybe now it was time to fight with truth. They left the ranch in the hands of 2 men to guard what was left and rode toward the ridge. The land stretched wide and empty, wind brushing the dry grass in waves. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed between red cliffs, and the sound of the river grew louder. When they reached the marker, half buried beneath sand and weeds, the rancher brushed the dirt away and stared. The old iron post stood firm, the etching faint but clear, proof that the water had once flowed wider before someone dammed and redirected it upstream. He looked at her. They cut it off on purpose, she nodded, and now we have the evidence. By the time they returned to the ranch, the company men were gone. Only smoke and hoofprints remained. The rancher didn't celebrate. He knew it wasn't over. But that night, for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. They rode into town 2 days later, the paper and marker sketches in hand. The sheriff, a man who'd been quiet through most of the trouble, listened while they explained. When they were done, he stood and poured himself a cup of coffee, silent for a long while. "You've got enough here to make a case," he said finally. "And if it goes to court in Santa Fe, they'll have to answer for it." The woman smiled faintly. "So it's over?" He shook his head. "It's never that simple. But you've made it a fair fight now." The next weeks were slow but steady. Letters were sent, statements gathered, and for once the law began to turn in their favor. The company men pulled back their operations, the wagons gone from the hills. The land agent who'd once sided with them came forward, swearing under oath that he'd been pressured to falsify the maps. By early winter, the case was settled. The rancher's land, and every small holding north of the river, was restored under rightful claim. The company's water rights were revoked, and their men sent packing under court order. It didn't bring back what was burned or lost, but it was justice, slow and real. The day the papers came in, the rancher stood outside his rebuilt barn, running his hand over the new boards. The woman approached from the house, her coat pulled close against the chill. "It's done," she said softly. He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Didn't think I'd live to see the land free again." She smiled a little. "You didn't give it up." "That's why it is." He looked at her then, really looked. So much of what they'd been through had blurred together, the fear, the long nights, the endless dust, but she was still there, steady and unbroken. "You could stay," he said quietly. She looked out toward the river. "Maybe for a while. There's still work to do," and she did stay, through the winter, through the long thaw that came after. Together they rebuilt what they could. The ranch hands returned, and a few families who had fled began to trickle back. The valley started to breathe again. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch watching the sun fall over the mountains. Sometimes they talked about the past, how the world was changing, how towns were growing and machines were coming. But mostly they talked about the land, the river, the things worth holding on to. One evening, after a long day mending the east fence, the woman spoke softly. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He chuckled. "Every time the wind cuts through my coat. But this place, it's who I am. I reckon I wouldn't know what to do anywhere else." She nodded, smiling faintly. "I know that feeling." He looked at her, eyes warm but tired. "You belong here too, whether you admit it or not." For a while, neither spoke. The stars came out one by one, soft and clear above the valley. The sound of the river drifted up from the canyon, steady, unbroken, as it had always been. As the months passed, the land healed. Green began to return to the pastures. The cattle grazed along the riverbank again. The scars from the fires slowly faded, replaced by new growth. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever truly was, but it was alive, and that was enough. In town, people spoke of the rancher and the woman as symbols of resilience, a reminder that sometimes standing firm meant more than fighting hard. And though both avoided that kind of talk, they couldn't help but feel proud when they saw life returning where it had once been scorched. By summer, travelers passing through the valley would see smoke from the chimneys again, hear laughter from the barns, and smell fresh-cut hay in the wind. The land had found its rhythm once more. One morning, standing by the river's edge, the rancher watched the sun rise over the water, its reflection trembling on the surface. The woman stood beside him, quiet. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that maybe the land chooses who stays and who doesn't?"
She smiled.
Maybe it does. Or maybe it just tests us until we prove we belong. He turned to her, eyes soft. Then I guess we passed. She laughed quietly, brushing her hand against the water. For now. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of grass and wildflowers. The valley stretched wide before them, calm and full of promise. For the first time in a long while, the rancher felt peace, not the loud kind that comes after a fight, but the quiet sort that settles deep in the bones. Life went on, as it always did. There were still fences to mend, storms to weather, and long days ahead. But there was also something worth waking for each morning, a future that felt earned. And as the sun climbed higher, casting gold over the river and the fields beyond, the rancher knew this land, scarred and stubborn as it was, had finally found its way back to freedom. The woman beside him looked toward the horizon, where the sky met the hills. It's strange, she said softly, how something broken can still be beautiful. He smiled, tipping his hat. That's what makes it worth keeping. And together, they turned back toward the ranch, toward the smoke curling from the chimney, the sound of the cattle lowing in the distance, and the promise of another day in the valley that had nearly been lost but wasn't.